The killing of Yahya Sinwar is seen as a critical moment in the war in Gaza. Israel has stopped short of declaring a victory against Hamas.
And Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says fighting will continue until the remaining Israeli hostages in the enclave are brought home. Sarah Coates tells us more.
Well, from what we do understand, according to this statement from the Israeli military, this actually happened on Wednesday. It happened during an encounter between Israeli military forces on the ground, infantry forces, and around 5 Hamas fighters. And according to this statement, they didn't actually realize that this person was Yahya Sinwar until a little after the fact. Now, this body was then taken to Israel for forensic testing. And it was late on Thursday night that the Israeli military actually put out a statement confirming the death of 61-year-old Yahya Sinwar. Now, sources from within Hamas have come out to say that we've suffered a blow and that consultations about the future have begun. Now, late Thursday night, we also heard from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He said that this is the beginning of the day after. I call on everyone who holds our hostages, whoever lays down his arms and returns our hostages, we will allow him to leave and to live. Also from the Pentagon spokesperson Pat Ryder, he delivered a press briefing. He said that there was no direct involvement of US forces, that this was an Israeli operation, but it is being celebrated on the streets of Tel Aviv and, of course, right across Israel. While on Thursday night as well, there were demonstrations here in Tel Aviv, and this was of the family members of the 101 hostages that are still being held in the Gaza Strip. What they want is to turn this military victory, as it's being seen, into a diplomatic victory to secure the release of these people. And they are calling on Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister, to do everything he can to secure a deal now. Sarah Coates for CNA, Tel Aviv.
All right, for more, let's speak now with Jonathan Panikoff. He's a director of Scowcroft, a Middle East security initiative at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan. And it's stunning news. And you said that this is far from the end of the story, but an opportunity to close a painful chapter in Israel's recent history. What did you mean by that? I mean, how significant is this moment as an inflection point?
Well, great to be with you and good morning. Look, it's very clearly a significant moment. Sinwar had been, in Israel's perspective, the impediment to getting a hostage deal. Israel says that he kept changing the terms. Obviously, a number of folks in the Arab world have accused Israel and Netanyahu of changing the terms. But the reality is, without Sinwar in place, I think Hamas is probably more interested in a hostage deal. He was the person that was really keeping things together, even as much of the group has said they really are exhausted, they need time to stop, they would rather have some sort of deal. That opportunity may now begin. And so Sinwar, having been the mastermind of 10-7, this closes the chapter on him. But as you heard from Netanyahu, it may not quite close the chapter on military operations in Gaza.
Okay, Jonathan, so a group that could be looking for some respite. We've heard phrases like potential game changer, a pivotal moment. And we've also heard statements from Netanyahu, Joe Biden, and Kamala Harris. You know, they sound very hopeful, but, you know, there is some caution in what they're saying as well. What could go wrong from here onwards?
Well, I think there's quite a bit, unfortunately, that could go wrong. So there's kind of two big issues. One is, who becomes the next leader of Hamas? If it's somebody like Mohammed Sinwar, Yahya Sinwar's brother, who is the architect of all of the tunnels in Gaza and has been known to be very close with his brother, then there's a good chance that Hamas's position is not going to change, that they're not going to be interested in a deal. But if it's somebody from the outside, the odds certainly increase that you could have a potential deal that comes to fruition with Israel. The other thing that could go wrong from the perspective of Hamas is, look, the command and control of the group has really been undermined. Israel over the last year has killed dozens of senior Hamas officials, dozens of military commanders. And so the question will be, does the group stay unified or does it splinter? So even if you have a core group that says, yes, we're going to respect a ceasefire, some fragments of it say, no, we're not going to respect it and are going to continue firing. And that can really complicate the situation.
Absolutely. And Jonathan, Netanyahu also has a chance to, declare victory and wind down the war now. How likely? I mean, will he take it?
Well, look, I think it's another reason for caution, frankly. The reality is, I think pressure on Netanyahu domestically is going to be greater than it ever has been throughout the last year. Now that Sinwar is dead, one of the main objectives of this war, according to Netanyahu, the demands for a hostage negotiation are going to be real. But the question still remains, how do you secure Israel when it comes to the remnants of Hamas, other Palestinian terrorist organizations like Palestinian Islamic Jihad that are based in Gaza? That calls for a strategic endgame that, frankly, the Israelis have not been that interested in trying to think through at any point of the last year. There's some rumors that they're working with the United Arab Emirates and maybe the U.S. I think Secretary Blinken's trip could certainly play a role here in helping to figure out what that endgame is. But in order for Netanyahu to take it, he's also going to have to take a strategic position about how the war ends, and he hasn't quite shown a readiness to do that.
Jonathan, you mentioned the importance of who would be Sinwar's replacement in terms of which direction the war might take. I want to ask you as well. I mean, is there a role for the rank and file of the group? Do they have a say? Do ordinary Gazans have a say in terms of who would be the next leader? That's one. And I guess the other question as well is there going to be influence from some of Hamas's allies in the region? You can name Hezbollah, you can name Iran, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is going to be an influence. So what will happen is that there's about a 50-member Shura Council who is going to meet, and it represents the 4 different groups of Hamas inside Gaza, inside the West Bank, those in the diaspora, and Palestinian prisoners. And together they have representatives, and they'll vote on a new leader. It's actually an ironically somewhat democratic process. But that doesn't mean it's not susceptible to outside influence. After Haniyeh was killed, the former overall leader, at the end of July by Israel in Tehran, the Iranians made it very clear, for instance, that Khaled Meshal, the former Hamas leader, was not a viable choice. Iran said that very clearly because Meshal had actually been against the Assad regime and supported Sunni opposition forces in Syria during that war. It angered Iran immensely. And so you do have an impact that will come from Iran, and that may come from others as well, in terms of where the leadership goes and how the next leader is chosen.
And Jonathan, we understand Sinwar's death comes weeks after the Hezbollah commander Hassan Nasrallah was also killed by Israel. I wonder what's next for Iran's axis of resistance. Will it ever be the same?
I think that's the million-dollar question. Look, Israel's goal is obviously that it not be the same, and I think that's the goal of a lot of the West, the United States included. The reality is Hamas's command and control and Hezbollah's command and control, political and military, really has been decimated over the last year, and especially over the last 3 to 4 months. And so Iran is going to have to make a determination of how much effort it wants to put forth to reestablish its allies in the region. It's going to be harder, frankly, because the smuggling tunnels that have worked so well for Hamas, Israel is going to demand that there be much more attention paid. The overland routes from Iran to Iraq to Syria to Lebanon and Hezbollah ultimately, I think, are more formidable to try to close down, but they're known now. That said, after 2006 and the Hezbollah-Israel war then, a lot of folks said, look, Hezbollah is decimated. They're not going to be a threat. And here we are today with Hezbollah more lethal than ever. I think Iran certainly is going to retry to constitute the Axis network. Whether or not it's possible, I think only time is going to tell.
And Jonathan, how do you think this is going to have, what impact, immediate impact, is this going to have on Israel's war against Hezbollah and Iran? We know that Hezbollah has previously said it would stop attacking Israel when the war ends. Are we way past that now?
I'm unfortunately a little concerned that we are. The irony of this timing is, had it happened 3 months ago, for instance, that Sinwar is killed, before Israel began operations in Lebanon, then I think there might have been a greater chance to prevent the type of war that we're seeing emerge there. Right now, I think it's unlikely Israel is going to completely stop and say, no, we're not going to go after the ballistic missiles. We know Hezbollah has the cruise missiles that are still a threat. I think Hezbollah would have to agree to a broader deal. Not only do they cease launching rocket attacks because there's a deal in Gaza, which they've always tied to, but they also agree to move forces, the Radwan forces, the special forces of Hezbollah, away from the Israeli border, as Israel has been demanding for a year now. And you have somebody that enforces Hezbollah's movement away so they can't come back 2-3 years from now. Without that, and I think it's unlikely, I don't also think it's going to be a great chance that that this war with Hezbollah is going to end immediately just because you may get a cessation of hostilities in Gaza.
All right, Jonathan, thank you very much for your time and your insight this morning. Jonathan Panikoff, the director of Scowcroft, the Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council.